Picture this. You are lying on your deathbed, completely unable to speak. The room is dark, the air is heavy, and the few advisors you have left, the very men you literally raised to power, are standing just outside your door. They are not mourning. Instead, they are secretly selling your kingdom to your greatest rival. Years later, when the official records are written, those exact same men will alter history to claim that handing the crown to your enemy was your dying wish. It sounds like the climax of a paranoid political thriller, but the reality is that this is the historically verified final chapter of one of the most famous, seemingly untouchable monarchs in human history. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Today, we have a massive mountain of historical evidence in front of us, ranging from diplomatic dispatches and fragmented biographies to intercepted letters and recently declassified 400-year-old manuscripts that completely upend the traditional narrative. Our mission is to take you through the astonishing life of Elizabeth I and entirely strip away the Golden Age propaganda. We are dismantling the brilliant illusion of the Virgin Queen standing imperiously draped in pearls with her hand on a globe, revealing instead a reality of profound, agonizing vulnerability. If you find yourself captivated by the hidden, darker truths behind history's greatest icons, please take a moment to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled so we can continue bringing these forgotten realities to light. To understand the world we are stepping into, we must recognize that this regime survived not through divine right, but through brutal, state-sponsored espionage, massive international conspiracies, and desperate survival tactics. This was an era defined by violent, decades-long struggles between Protestants and Catholics, where religion was not a matter of personal conscience, but the ultimate political identifier. Differing faiths represented literal, existential threats to the state. We are looking at these historical viewpoints, plots, and severe state violence exactly as they appear in the primary material, conveying the immense, crushing pressures of the 16th century. To understand how Elizabeth ruled with such an iron grip, you must first understand how incredibly close she came to never ruling at all. We tend to view her as an inevitable force of nature, but her early life was defined by sheer, unadulterated terror. Born in 1533 to King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, her entire world was violently dismantled within 3 years. Her mother was beheaded on the orders of her father. Henry VIII then went a step further, having his marriage to Anne officially annulled. This legal maneuver instantly transformed the toddler from a celebrated royal heir into a literal royal bastard. This was an erasure of her legal existence. As an illegitimate child, she had no legal right to inherit, no clear place in the line of succession, and was stripped of all protections, left entirely at the mercy of her father's volatile whims. From there, the Tudor dynasty effectively went to war with itself, creating a violent pendulum swing in the nation's identity. First, her younger half-brother, Edward VI, took the throne, instituting a radical, uncompromising brand of Protestantism before dying at just 15. Then, her older half-sister, Mary I, took power. Mary was a devout Catholic whose singular mission was to return England to the Pope's authority by violently purging Edward's Protestant reforms. Right in the middle of this intense religious whiplash was Elizabeth. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth's very existence was a threat because she was the daughter of the woman who caused Henry to break with Rome in the first place. She became the natural, symbolic figurehead for every Protestant rebellion, regardless of whether she supported them. Mary was deeply and justifiably suspicious, leading to Elizabeth's harrowing imprisonment in the Tower of London. she was brought in through Traitor's Gate, surrounded by the exact same walls where her mother had been beheaded, subjecting her to completely paralyzing psychological terror. Later, moved to strict house arrest at places like Hampton Court Palace, she lived under daily suspicion of treason, constantly surrounded by spies. She survived this gauntlet by adopting a strategy of politic silence. She understood that any overt action or written word of defiance would literally be her death warrant. So, she outwardly conformed to Catholicism, attending Mass and going through the religious motions, while keeping her true internal loyalties completely impenetrable. Her letters to Mary from this period are masterpieces of saying absolutely nothing. They are dripping with familial devotion, but completely devoid of any concrete political stance, giving her enemies zero ammunition. She had learned from her father's tyranny and her 4 stepmothers that making a definitive stand or simply being too visible was a fatal mistake. This survival is deeply ironic given the gender politics of the era. 16th century men were fundamentally convinced that women were biologically and intellectually unfit to hold power. The Scottish theologian John Knox wrote a famous tract arguing that women were naturally weak, easily manipulated, emotionally fragile, and a literal curse upon any nation they attempted to govern. Yet, while men wrote treatises on female fragility, Elizabeth was surviving a psychological meat grinder that would have broken hardened military commanders, navigating constant surveillance and intense interrogation while maintaining absolute emotional control. However, walking this tightrope over a pit of vipers left permanent scars. When she finally became queen, she was infamous for her extreme caution and maddening indecisiveness. Counselors would beg her to sign treaties or authorize military actions, and she would stall for months, sometimes years. This was not a character flaw. It was a highly honed survival mechanism. For Elizabeth, committing to a single course of action usually meant death, and she learned that delaying kept her options open and kept her alive. She carried this trauma response directly into her statecraft. When she took the throne in 1558 at the age of 25, the existential threat shifted. She was no longer dodging the executioner's block. She was dodging the marriage altar. The unquestioned expectation was that a queen regnant must marry quickly, as her Privy Council believed a woman couldn't handle military strategy or international diplomacy alone. More urgently, the dynasty desperately needed a legitimate heir to prevent a civil war upon her death. The pressure was suffocating, and the roster of suitors read like a list of the most powerful men in Europe. There was King Philip II of Spain, her late sister's widower, King Eric XIV of Sweden, and Francis, the Duke of Anjou, representing France. At home, there was her personal favorite, the English courtier Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Historical consensus suggests he was the only suitor she possessed genuine romantic feelings for, but the established nobility despised him as an arrogant upstart. In 1560, a scandal erupted that permanently altered her reign. Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a short flight of stairs with a broken neck, while the rest of her household was inexplicably away at a local fair. The optics were disastrous. Though the official inquest ruled it an accidental death possibly related to illness, rumors spread like wildfire that Dudley murdered his wife with Elizabeth's tacit approval so they could marry. Marrying him then would have been political suicide, confirming malicious rumors, and potentially sparking a rebellion. Elizabeth had to step back from Dudley, but crucially, she didn't reject the foreign suitors. Her Virgin Queen image was a massive PR campaign covering a brilliant geopolitical strategy. She constantly entertained the possibility of marriage without ever committing at the altar, sending affectionate letters and keeping foreign ambassadors indefinitely interested. This paralyzed her enemies. Rejecting King Philip outright risked a Spanish invasion, but marrying him would subordinate England to Spanish interests and alienate her Protestant subjects. Marrying the Duke of Anjou risked dragging England into France's internal religious wars. Her solution was infinite negotiation, using her singleness as a geopolitical wedge to keep Europe's superpowers completely off balance. She famously declared, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." Under the common law doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal rights were subsumed by her husband. The expectation was that a royal husband would become the true sovereign, commanding the armies and controlling the treasury. Having watched marriage strip women of their autonomy her entire life, she refused to allow anyone to usurp her authority. Her virginity was a fiercely guarded, highly weaponized political asset that allowed her to project the image of a queen married to her country, demanding absolute loyalty without sharing power. But this masterful image came with a terrifying cost. By refusing to produce an heir, a massive vacuum formed at the center of English politics. And nature abhors a vacuum. Into that void stepped her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, triggering a staggering 19-year standoff. Mary's arrival in England was a spectacular fall from grace. In 1567, her husband, Lord Darnley, was assassinated, his house blown up, and his body found strangled in the garden. Months later, Mary catastrophically married the primary suspect, the Earl of Bothwell. The Scottish nobility revolted, forcing Mary to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James. Fleeing into England in 1568, she expected sanctuary and military aid to retake Scotland. Instead, Elizabeth gave her a gilded cage, placing her under house arrest because she was simply too dangerous to let loose. Mary had Tudor blood and, crucially, was Catholic. To Catholic Europe, Elizabeth was an illegitimate heretic, and Mary was the true, lawful Queen of England. The situation exploded in 1570 when Pope Pius V issued a papal bull titled Regnans in Excelsis. This was a political weapon of mass destruction that officially excommunicated Elizabeth and released all English Catholics from their oaths of allegiance, effectively commanding them not to obey her laws. Overnight, the Pope turned a sizable portion of the population into potential sleeper agents. Before this, Elizabeth operated with relative tolerance, famously stating she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. But the papal bull weaponized the faith, making it a religious duty to overthrow the queen and legally codifying Catholicism as high treason. This single decree acted as the starting gun for a wave of terrifying, highly organized plots that would force Elizabeth into the darkest, most ruthless corners of statecraft imaginable. This papal decree of 1570 acted as the starting gun for a wave of terrifying, highly organized plots to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. We see the Ridolfi plot in 1571, orchestrated by Roberto di Ridolfi, an Italian banker who used his international financial connections to coordinate with the Spanish Duke of Alba. They were planning for 10,000 Spanish troops to invade from the Netherlands, murder Elizabeth, and then marry Mary to the English Duke of Norfolk. Ridolfi wasn't a lone fanatic. He had the explicit backing of the Pope and King Philip II of Spain, and he compiled detailed lists estimating he could rally nearly 40,000 armed Catholic men within England to join the Spanish forces once they landed. This was followed by the Throckmorton plot in 1583, where Francis Throckmorton acted as a clandestine courier between Mary, the Spanish ambassador, and the French Duke of Guise to plot a French invasion completely bankrolled by Spanish gold. Finally came the Babington plot in 1586, led by a wealthy young Catholic named Anthony Babington, which featured highly detailed, explicit plans to dispatch assassins to kill Elizabeth while liberating Mary from her captivity. Looking at this relentless barrage of assassination attempts, the obvious question arises: why didn't Elizabeth just execute Mary immediately in 1568 when she had her in custody? This brings us right back to the ideological foundation of 16th century monarchy. Elizabeth believed with every fiber of her being in the divine right of kings. Monarchs were chosen by God, elevated above ordinary humanity, and Mary was an anointed sovereign. Elizabeth was terrified of the precedent it would set. If she signed a legal document authorizing the execution of a fellow queen, she was permanently shattering the illusion of divine invulnerability. She would be showing the world and her own subjects that a monarch could be judged, condemned, and slaughtered by the state, just like a common criminal. She was paralyzed by the fear that the blade used on Mary would eventually find its way to her own neck. But she couldn't survive these massive, well-funded international conspiracies purely through indecision. She survived because a dark, deeply hidden apparatus was built to protect her. That apparatus was constructed by Sir Francis Walsingham, officially her principal secretary, but rightly remembered by history as her spymaster. He realized very early on that the traditional methods of state security, like guards, walls, and overt military strength, were basically useless against ideological warfare and hidden plots. He understood that to protect the Queen, he needed to build a pervasive, invisible empire of information. The scale of what Walsingham built is staggering. He essentially created a 16th century CIA, or MI6, that operated entirely off the books. The historical records show he managed a network of 53 deep-cover spies within England alone, and 18 foreign agents embedded in major cities across Europe, including Paris, Madrid, Rome, and even as far as Constantinople. He literally pioneered the mechanics of early modern espionage, moving far beyond merely listening at keyholes. He employed brilliant mathematicians as code breakers, cryptanalysts, and linguistic experts. His agents utilized sophisticated techniques that sound like modern spycraft, using invisible ink made from alum, lemon juice, or milk, which required specific heat sources to activate and read. They developed complex nomenclators, cipher systems that used a mix of substituted letters and specialized symbols for specific names or places, making frequency analysis incredibly difficult. He set up dead letterboxes across Europe, paid harbor masters to track the movements of suspicious individuals entering English ports, and utilized the devastating psychological tactic of turning ideological enemies into double agents. Walsingham was entirely ruthless, and he wasn't afraid of utilizing black ops. Look at the case of John Story in 1570, an English Catholic exile plotting against Elizabeth from the safety of the Low Countries. Walsingham didn't have time to ask for extradition. His agents fabricated a business dispute, lured Story onto a merchant ship under false pretenses, locked him in the hold, and illegally smuggled him back to England, where he was brutally interrogated and executed. While we often think of the cultural flourishing of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre when we think of this era, that society was built on a foundation of severe paranoia and systemic surveillance. Walsingham heavily utilized torture, specifically the rack in the Tower of London, to extract confessions. English Catholics were forced to build intricate priest holes behind fireplaces and under floorboards just to hide their clergy, because if a Catholic priest was discovered, the penalty wasn't just imprisonment. It was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Walsingham's absolute masterpiece, the operation that defined his career and finally sealed Mary, Queen of Scots' fate, was the Babington plot sting. in 1586. Walsingham knew Mary was the nexus of the treason, but Elizabeth demanded undeniable written proof that Mary actively supported an assassination attempt. She needed a smoking gun. To get it, Walsingham initiated a brilliant long-con sting operation by employing a double agent named Gilbert Gifford. Posing as a devoted Catholic, Gifford approached Mary in her isolated captivity and convinced her that he had successfully established a highly secure, undetectable smuggling route to connect her with her supporters on the outside. The mechanics of this route were ingenious. They used the actual kegs of beer being delivered to Mary's castle. The brewers would place letters wrapped in leather inside the hollowed-out waterproof bungs used to seal the kegs. Mary thought it was the perfect covert communication line, writing deeply treasonous letters in complex cipher, sealing them in the beer bungs, and sending them off to Anthony Babington. But she had no idea she was playing directly into Walsingham's hands. Gifford was taking every single barrel straight to the intelligence apparatus. Walsingham's men carefully extracted the letters and handed them to Thomas Phillips, his master codebreaker. Phillips was a master of frequency analysis. Even when substituting symbols for letters, certain letters in the English language, like E or T, appear with predictable frequency. By meticulously tracking how often certain symbols appeared and guessing common words, Phillips slowly rebuilt her cipher key from scratch. It was incredibly tedious, but once he translated the letters, he didn't destroy them. He carefully resealed the waterproof packets, placed them back in the barrels, and sent them on their way to Babington. They let the plot run, allowing Mary and Babington to correspond freely for months, so Walsingham could map out the entire conspiracy and gather the names of every single traitor involved. They waited for Mary to cross the point of no return. On July 17, 1586, she finally did, writing what historians now refer to as the Gallows Letter. Babington had laid out the plan to assassinate Elizabeth, and Phillips deciphered Mary's reply, where she explicitly approved the assassination and gave logistical advice on how to proceed. She had literally signed her own death warrant. Walsingham swooped in. The conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed. Mary was put on trial for treason, and faced with her own deciphered letters, was found guilty. But even then, with absolute proof, Elizabeth's trauma response kicked in. She was legally required to sign the execution warrant, but she was utterly paralyzed by indecision. She stalled. She signed the warrant, handing it to her junior secretary, William Davison, but immediately gave vague, contradictory instructions, claiming she told him to hold on to it and not have it sealed or delivered yet. Her privy counselors, led by William Cecil, knew exactly what she was doing. They knew she would stall until she changed her mind. They held a secret meeting without her, took the signed warrant, attached the Great Seal of England, and immediately dispatched men to Fotheringhay Castle. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. When the news reached London, Elizabeth's reaction was explosive. She flew into an uncontrollable rage, wept openly, dressed herself in full mourning black, and banned her counselors from her presence. She even threw William Davison into the Tower of London, claiming he defied her explicit orders and effectively murdered a queen without her consent. However, the authenticity of that outrage is deeply questioned. Considering her entire history of manipulation, historians debate if she deliberately gave contradictory instructions, knowing the council would act on the signature, just so she could guarantee Mary's death while maintaining complete plausible deniability. It is a highly compelling theory. Elizabeth was arguably the greatest political actor of her generation. By orchestrating this scenario, she achieved her ultimate goal. The threat of Mary was eliminated, satisfying her Protestant subjects, while she could simultaneously write to the outraged Catholic monarchs of Europe and claim her hands were clean. blaming the execution entirely on rogue ministers who disobeyed her. It was a staggering display of Machiavellian brilliance. Regardless of the theater, the execution fundamentally changed the geopolitical landscape. While Mary was alive, King Philip II of Spain hesitated to launch a full-scale invasion of England because Mary had deep, lifelong ties to France, which was Spain's primary rival. Philip didn't want to conquer England just to hand it to a French ally. With Mary dead, that buffer evaporated. Philip lost his internal Catholic candidate for the English throne. Furthermore, Mary had supposedly written a will naming Philip as her heir to the English crown, giving him the ideological justification he needed for a direct, brute force invasion, claiming the throne of England for himself. This moves us from the shadow war of spies directly onto the global chessboard. In 1588, Philip unleashes the Spanish Armada. The sheer scale of this force is terrifying. An invasion fleet of 130 ships manned by 8,000 sailors and carrying 18,000 heavily armed soldiers. Their mission was to sail up the English Channel, link up with the Spanish army in the Netherlands, and completely crush Protestant England. But the defeat of the Spanish Armada is heavily mythologized. The English fleet, led by commanders like Charles Howard and Francis Drake, utilized smaller, more maneuverable ships. The turning point occurred at Calais, where the English deployed fire ships, vessels packed with pitch and gunpowder, set ablaze, and steered directly into the anchored Spanish formation. They broke the Spanish line, scattering their ships in panic. This was followed by the Battle of Gravelines, where English cannons battered the disorganized Spanish fleet. The final, devastating blow, however, wasn't military. It was meteorological. Unprecedented storms smashed the retreating Spanish ships against the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The Elizabethan propaganda machine seized upon this immediately, branding the storms the Protestant wind and minting commemorative medals declaring God breathed and they were scattered. It was framed not just as a military victory, but as an undeniable divine endorsement of the Virgin Queen. Like God himself had intervened to protect England, state propaganda is an incredibly powerful tool, and history is overwhelmingly written by the victors. The English government desperately needed to maintain that aura of divine invincibility, which is why history completely ignores the English Armada. Almost no one talks about what happened the very next year in 1589, when the English launched a counter-armada commanded by Sir Francis Drake, which was an unmitigated, catastrophic failure. The objective was solid on paper. Elizabeth ordered Drake to sail to the northern ports of Spain, to hunt down and destroy the battered remnants of the Spanish fleet while they were being repaired, and then sailed to Lisbon to ignite a Portuguese rebellion against King Philip. But the fatal flaw was how this expedition was funded. Elizabeth didn't have the treasury to pay for a massive standing navy, so the English Armada was essentially organized as a joint stock company. That financial structure doomed the mission because the expedition relied heavily on private investors like nobles, merchants, and even Drake himself, who expected a financial return on their capital. They didn't care about destroying docked warships. They cared about capturing treasure. Drake blatantly ignored the Queen's strategic military orders. The economic pressure from his investors forced his hand. Instead of destroying the Spanish fleet, he sailed to the town of Coruña because he believed it held wealth. He attacked the town seeking plunder, but the Spanish defenses were formidable, and the English became bogged down in a grueling siege. They lost massive numbers of men, not just to Spanish gunfire, but to rampant disease and starvation. By the time Drake finally reached Lisbon, his forces were decimated. The Portuguese population, seeing a starving, diseased English force with no siege artillery, wisely decided not to rebel. The English were repelled with ease. It was a complete horror show. Primary sources describe the English ships limping back to port, with crews so ravaged by disease they had to toss their dead overboard by the hundreds every single day. They achieved zero strategic objectives, suffered horrific casualties, and the expedition completely bankrupted the English treasury that Elizabeth had spent 30 years meticulously building. Yet the propaganda machine buried it so deep that most people today don't even know it happened. But this crushing military disaster was merely the prelude to a terrifying domestic reality. As the glittering facade of the Golden Age began to crumble, the Queen would be forced into a brutal economic shadow war, leading to a silent, devastating betrayal that would rewrite history itself. Where the English did find economic success against Spain was through a highly organized system of state-sponsored piracy. Elizabeth unleashed her sea dogs. Men like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Thomas Cavendish. The only legal distinction between a privateer and a pirate in the 16th century was a letter of marque, which was a government license authorizing private individuals to attack and capture vessels belonging to an enemy nation. To the Spanish, these men were ruthless pirates, but to the English, they were naval heroes. These privateers sailed to the Spanish West Indies and the Americas, ambushing the massive treasure galleons that were transporting New World silver back to Spain. It was a devastating economic bleed tactic. By capturing that silver, they deprived King Philip of the funds he desperately needed to finance his massive European armies. Simultaneously, this tactic injected massive amounts of stolen wealth directly into the English economy, proving to be an incredible return on investment for Elizabeth and the courtiers who funded the voyages. But despite the lucrative privateering, the formal, grueling war with Spain dragged on for over a decade, taking a terrible toll on the country. As we enter the 1590s, the glittering facade of the Golden Age begins to crumble entirely. The economic reality of her later years is incredibly grim. The immense cost of a long war causes massive inflation, and a series of terrible harvests leads to widespread starvation across the country. The towns are flooded with desperate, unemployed soldiers returning from the wars. The social fabric is tearing so badly that the government is forced to pass the Elizabethan Poor Laws in 1601, creating the first national system to manage the exploding population of impoverished, starving vagrants. Overshadowing all of this crushing domestic misery is the psychological terror of a monarch who is visibly failing, yet fiercely refuses to name a successor. Elizabeth is growing old. She is losing her hair, and her teeth are blackened from sugar decay. To maintain her aura of immortality, she relies heavily on the mask of youth. The details of this makeup are horrifying. She paints her face completely white using ceruse, a mixture of vinegar and white lead, essentially giving herself severe lead poisoning every single day to hide her wrinkles and smallpox scars. Wearing bright red wigs, she desperately tries to project the image of the timeless Virgin Queen to a court that can see right through it. This desperation leads to one of the most profound, yet completely silent betrayals in royal history. Elizabeth's most trusted advisor in her final years is Sir Robert Cecil, the son of her lifelong minister, William Cecil, and the man who essentially runs her government. While Elizabeth is layering on lead makeup, pretending she will live forever, Robert Cecil is secretly writing letters to Scotland, orchestrating the end of her dynasty. Starting in 1601, Cecil opens a highly classified, treasonous correspondence with James VI of Scotland. The irony is almost too perfect for fiction. James VI is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the exact woman Elizabeth agonized over executing 14 years prior. Now, Elizabeth's own chief minister is secretly negotiating with Mary's son right under the Queen's nose to ensure he takes the throne. Cecil operated in absolute, terrifying secrecy. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that if Elizabeth discovered this communication with her successor, she would interpret it as high treason. The paranoia was immense, forcing them to use numeric codes for their identities. In the letters, King James was designated as 30, and Robert Cecil was 10. A surviving historical anecdote perfectly encapsulates the unbearable tension of this secret. Cecil is riding in a carriage with the Queen when a diplomatic courier arrives holding a mail pouch from Scotland. Elizabeth, whose paranoia has only sharpened with age, immediately demands to inspect the contents of the bag. Cecil is holding a bag that contains his treasonous correspondence. If she reads the letters, his life is over. Put yourself in his shoes in that carriage. The panic must have been absolute. But Cecil executes a masterful psychological manipulation. He reaches to open the bag, but suddenly recoils. He turns to the Queen and tells her that the leather bag is filthy, covered in mud from the journey, and that it smells absolutely putrid. He suggests that out of respect for her royal sensibilities, she should wait until the letters have been properly aired out before handling them. He leverages a known vulnerability. Elizabeth is famously sensitive to bad odors, constantly wearing heavily perfumed gloves specifically to mask the stench of the 16th century world. Repulsed by the thought of the smell, she simply waves the bag away, and Cecil's quick thinking saves his head. Stepping back, what does this all mean for Elizabeth's power at the very end? She had spent 45 years refusing to name an heir because she understood a fundamental rule of politics. The moment you name a successor, the sun sets on your reign. She knew her court would instantly abandon her to curry favor with the rising sun. She thought that by keeping the succession a secret, she could prevent a coup. But the devastating reality was that her silence didn't prevent the coup. It merely forced it underground. She maintained her divine, untouchable image to her dying breath. But the political reality was that the men running her government had already abandoned her. They were actively constructing the next regime while she was still breathing in the next room. Her isolation at the very end was absolute. Which brings us back to our opening scenario and a stunning final revelation found within recently declassified manuscripts. For 4 centuries, our understanding of Elizabeth's reign has been heavily shaped by a foundational historical text written shortly after her death. But recently, researchers used modern, multispectral imaging technology to examine the original handwritten drafts of that text. Hidden beneath heavily crossed out lines underneath pasted over pages, they discovered massive censorship. What the imaging revealed changes the entire ending of the story. For hundreds of years, the official narrative, the one taught in schools, was that on her deathbed, Elizabeth finally relented. The story went that in her last moments, she used her final bit of strength to make a hand gesture, officially naming James of Scotland as her lawful heir and finally bringing peace to the realm. The hidden text reveals that this story was completely fabricated. The original notes state clearly that Elizabeth never named James. In her final hours, she was far too crippled by illness and possibly lead poisoning to speak or make coherent gestures. The official history was intentionally altered, rewriting the final moments of her life to appease King James, who was now the patron of the historian and the new King of England. A smooth, preordained succession was entirely manufactured to legitimize the new regime. It is a chilling realization, leaving us with a profound final thought. If the very conclusion of her reign was a literal physical rewrite of history by the men who survived her, a forgery designed to make themselves look legitimate, how much of Elizabeth's glittering golden age was an objective reality? And how much of it was simply the most ruthlessly successful PR campaign in human history. It forces us to reevaluate every letter, every portrait, and every law from that era. We are left to question whether the Virgin Queen was the master of her domain, or a woman trapped inside an image she couldn't escape. If this exploration changed how you see the Virgin Queen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. We rely on you to help us keep uncovering the truth behind history's greatest myths. Drop a comment below. Do you think Elizabeth was a master manipulator or a captive to her own image? Thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, keep questioning the history you've been told.